Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Martha Capitano. I work for Federal Highway Administrations and the Office of Operations. I am the technical lead for this Commercial Motor Vehicle Safety in Work Zones initiative, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Martha. My name is Melissa Finley, and I'll be assisting with the webinar today. We're going to go over a few housekeeping items to begin with. First of all, we want to make sure that you understand the disclaimer that this presentation was created and is being presented by FHWA, the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, the Indiana Department of Transportation, and Purdue University. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are the presenters and do not necessarily reflect those of FHWA or USDOT. The contents do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the Department of Transportation. The contents of the FHWA presentation does not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the public in any way. The presentation is intended only to provide clarity regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies. Today, we're using a webinar platform that allows us to record for note-taking purposes and to be used later on. If you experience any issues with your audio through the computer, you can dial the conference line, and Sarah Lettuce, who's helping us in the background, will put that information over in the chat box. So across the top part of your screen, there are several icons that I want to quickly explain. One is the participants. You see two people sitting there. If you click on that, that will give you a list of participants. Next to that is a call out or conversation bubble. If you click on that, that'll be the chat box where you can find some of the information that we'll be discussing, links for resources, the conference line, and we're going to be doing a poll here shortly that will place the link in that chat box. So make sure you know how to navigate over there. There's also the ability for you to press the next button that has the person that's smiling, and you'll see several choices for some icons or emojis, and there's one there that will allow you to raise your hand. We are going to have several presentations this morning. We will hold all questions until the end, but we have time for Q&A. So at that point, you'll be allowed to raise your hand. Myself as the facilitator can then call on you to unmute and ask your question verbally. You also may enter questions or comments throughout the discussion and presentations in the chat box. And during that Q&A time, I will also try to address as many of those as possible. We do ask that you keep your phone or computer muted when you're not speaking. Again, you can see across the top part of your bar, there is a camera icon and a microphone icon. If there is a slash through both those, it means we cannot see you or we cannot hear you. And we do ask that you keep yourself muted as our presenters are speaking today. Our presenters for today are Martha Kapitanoff with the FHWA Office of Operations, myself, Melissa Finley with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, John McGregor and Misha Cockler with the Indiana Department of Transportation, and Darcy Bullock with the Purdue University. From today's webinar, we hope that you're able to recognize the impact of CMV safety on crashes in work zones. You're going to hear about ongoing efforts with opportunity states, learn about some best practices that were recently identified in some workshops that were held with the opportunity states, as well as some experiences from the Indiana Department of Transportation with active work zone management and the Protect the Queue program. And last but not least, we'll discover some available resources on this topic. So before we get started with our presenters, I will ask that you go over and answer a question for us so we can know a little bit more about our audience. Sarah is going to place the link for this poll that you see here on the screen in the chat box. We ask that you click on that, and then I'm going to exit out of this presentation so Sarah can bring up the live results so we can see just who we're speaking with today. So again, if you'll find the chat box that's next to the participant list, if you click on that button, you will be able to click on the poll anywhere and do that. I see some folks entering in the chat. That helps as well. If you don't have the capability to be able to click on that link, we'll be able to use that data. So thank you for participating that way as well. Give you a few minutes to respond. See, a large number are state and local DOT, but we do have some consultants and other folks from the federal government and private sector. All right, I appreciate everybody replying either in the chat or again, if you want to click on that link. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing. I think we'll go ahead and move on. All right, well, we're going to get started with our presenters that I mentioned earlier today. So Martha, would you like to take back over, please?
Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. Next, please. So before we share some information with you, I want to make sure that everybody understands when we say the definitions for commercial motor vehicle as well as work zone that we have been using throughout this effort. So Federal Highway has been partnering for a few years now with NHTSA and Federal Motor Carrier and other stakeholders, trying to find ways on how to improve commercial motor vehicle safety and work zone. So for commercial motor vehicle, we agreed to use a terminology used by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which is a gross vehicle weight or gross combination weight of 10,001 or more pounds. Next, please. And for work zones, we follow the Manual Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the 2009 being the final version, that defines work zones as an area of a roadway where construction, maintenance, or utility work is occurring. Next, please. So unfortunately, the number of work zone crashes and fatalities continue to go up, with 2019 being the latest data available from the NHTSA FAR system. There were 762 fatal crashes in work zones. Out of those, 250 fatal crashes involve a CMV. And when I said involve, it doesn't mean that the large truck or bus was at fault. It means that the CMV impacted another vehicle or person or was impacted by a vehicle. Next, please. This gives you an idea of, and I forgot to mention that unfortunately over the years, about 30% of fatal work zone crashes involve a CMV. So this graph shows you that unfortunately the numbers continue to go up. As you can see, there's 30% on CMV involved work zone crashes, and we have to find ways on how to improve commercial motor vehicle safety in work zones nationwide. Next, please. This gives you an idea of where in the trends for work zones and non-work zones by manner of collisions. So it gives you an idea where some states could focus their efforts at a national level. It gives us an understanding of where these CMV involved fatal crashes are occurring. Rear end collisions appear to be overrepresented, and CMV involved fatal crashes in work zones. This is not surprising, since unexpected slowdowns and cues from work zone related activities can contribute to more rear end collisions. Next one, please. So we have several efforts within Federal Highway. For the past, we had a previous effort where we worked closely with some of our states and are currently developing a voluntary action plan, but that can be used by anybody in the nation. But our current effort, and one of the reasons why we're here today, is to share some of the findings that we have and some strategies that we have been sharing throughout this new effort that is working closely with our 10 opportunity states. So as part of this current task was to conduct the targeted state level effort to promote commercial motor vehicle safety in work zones. We work closely with those 10 opportunity states. We delivered 10 tailored state specific workshops. We are finalizing some of the state-specific action plans. Some of the states, majority of the states already have their state-specific action plans. These are not shared with anybody because they're state-specific. And as part of that task was to have today's webinar. Next, please. Okay, so with that, unless anybody has any questions, I will let Melissa go over the next presentation, but we'll wait. We'll get all the questions at the end, so feel free to add your questions in the chat box.
Great, thank you, Martha. All right, as Martha mentioned, we have been conducting workshops with the 10 opportunity states, and I'm going to quickly take a few minutes to go over some of the main items that we've been hearing out of those workshops. We can't cover everything. Those workshops are 2 half days each for every opportunity state, so we obviously can cover a lot more information. So I want to give you some highlights today, and then obviously if you have additional questions, we can address those during our time today, or feel free to follow up with Martha about that. So one of the things that we talked about in a lot of the workshops had to do with improving the temporary traffic control considerations early on in the project development process to help engineers and designers identify potential CMV issues early in the project and suggest mitigation strategies for those to better accommodate the CMVs during project scoping and even preliminary design. Mainly so these don't come as a surprise at some point in the project or in addition. We just encourage you to start thinking up front, especially on major corridors where you know you have a lot of CMV traffic. A couple of things in particular that we talked about surrounding this topic was the importance of considering the temporal effects of CMVs and sensitivity analysis when considering queue formation potential and selecting the queue mitigation measures that you might want to use. We also discussed the need to check for design components that might impact CMV safety or contribute to speed differentials early on in the project. This could include consideration of your lane widths, your shoulder condition, the use or all or part of your shoulder as a travel lane to better accommodate CMVs, barrier offsets, the width of the temporary traffic control device themselves and how that may impact your lane width, your available lane width for travel, workspace needs, temporary traffic control device or work encroachment, and the design of the transitions into and out of the work zone, as well as entry and exit points for the work vehicles. Best practices to better accommodate CMVs could include a variety of things, but particular surrounding this activity, we talked a lot about going beyond the minimum design requirements and avoiding design exceptions as much as possible. Could extend the lane closure taper to account for actual operating speeds, not just the posted work zone speed limit. Providing longitudinal buffer space after the merge points and before temporary barriers. Designing crossovers and lane shifts to better accommodate those CMVs. Ensuring extra lane width through those crossovers to try to help with side swipes and other kinds of crashes, and removing edgeline rumble strips as needed, again, to accommodate that shifting maybe of traffic, the utilization of a shoulder, etc. We also want to consider early on in the project the use of technology to inform motorists about work zone conditions. There's a lot of smart work zone technology out there that states are using or beginning to use. And so just encouraging the consideration of those earlier in the project and how they may be a mitigation measure. And stakeholders also identified the need for training aimed at designers about the things that I basically just went over, as well as some additional details about the impact of those on CMV safety, and really candidly talking about field conditions and contractor workspace requirements and how those are needed and might differ from what they're putting in the plans to the reality that happens on the pavements, and just being candid about those, making them aware of those, and again, just earlier in the project to help when we're actually building the project and having construction on the ground. And then for projects on major CMV corridors, at several workshops, we talked about engaging the trucking industry earlier on in the process, especially on those major corridors, inviting them to the table so that they can help you identify those potential issues and suggest mitigation measures. In particular, one smart work zone technology that we discussed a lot was that those used to alert and detect for queue detection. And so we wanted to share as part of this workshop just some findings that we have been sharing with those stakeholders. These are some results from 4 different studies that have been conducted. You can see the results do vary, and it really is dependent upon the type of analysis that's done, the type of system that's installed, and how it's used. And you can see here, I'll just point out one of the most recent studies that was done in Texas, and this was conducted knowing when queuing was verified, and we knew that was happening out there. You can see some of the greatest results there in your reduction in total crashes, as well as your reduction in injury crashes. But do just want to point out that smart work zone technology, the effectiveness of those systems really does depend upon how often and how long queues form and the quality of the technology and its deployment. So if you would like more information on these studies, we'll be glad to get that for you. We also talked at several of the workshops about the dynamic merge lane closure kind of system. There are several benefits to this system. The idea is that when you have more traffic on the roadway, you can switch to a different setup that allows your vehicles to use both lanes. And maybe when traffic volumes are lighter, they can use the lane closure in the traditional manner of moving over further upstream and forming a single line. The benefits are shorter queue lengths when you do have those higher traffic volumes. Hopefully there's fewer last-second merge conflicts, and then hopefully reduced road wage. But we will say that we had very candid discussions at the workshops about whether or not they were working as expected based on driver education and understanding of how the system was going to work. So that's one key challenge. I'm going to mention a little bit more about that in my next slide, but also just making sure you're coordinating with enforcement, especially if your state has move over laws. Depending on where your enforcement may be located and you're trying to conduct this dynamic merge, you're trying to get folks to either use the single or both lanes. If they need to move over because of where the law enforcement is positioned, that may cause extra weaving or problems that you really don't want based on the system that you have instituted. So just make sure you're coordinating with law enforcement about where they're located and how that move over law may impact the operations of the dynamic merge. This is an example of some information that was released by the Illinois Department of Transportation. Several of the other opportunity states have done videos or other kind of PSAs about the dynamic merge when they're implementing that. But we did still hear several discussions about that drivers may not appear to understand the concept. Issues with CMV drivers straddling both lanes to block traffic from using the full capacity, non-CMV drivers not moving over early or increasing the queue length when they're supposed to be using both of the lanes instead of a single lane. And so a lot of discussion about additional driver education materials that are needed for this concept. And we, after the discussion, came away saying that those driver education materials really should explain the proper driving behavior and why it is needed in both situations, and really the benefits to all drivers when the posted instructions are followed. Another interesting application that we learned about throughout the workshops was one that was used by the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission. So in some cases, it may be desired to encourage or require CMVs to use the left lane through your work zone. Reasons for this strategy might include substandard right lane pavements or to improve the merging opportunities for ramp traffic. And like I said, recently the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission required CMVs to use the left lane to improve CMV safety in a work zone. They use static signs as well as dynamic message signs and pavement markings and other devices to communicate this restriction to the drivers. The innovative signs shown here were developed by the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission and are currently used in their work zones. But we do acknowledge that CMV use of left lane may not be appropriate for all work zones. So we encourage stakeholders to develop a decision-making process that includes guidance that can aid in the proper consideration of this strategy on future projects. State DOTs and other agencies that might want to implement this should also develop specifications and standards associated for the signing and the pavement markings that would need to be used. And then, of course, public outreach and enforcement are also critical to the success of this strategy. Lots of discussion also surrounded speed differentials that occur in construction areas. And one of those locations where that happens is where we have construction vehicles entering or exiting the workspace. Those highly transitory events can cause slowdowns and backups that aren't necessarily associated with the traditional speed differential that we think about from the back of a queue that we mentioned technologies may be able to help you with. So we talked a lot about providing acceleration and deceleration lanes and designing maybe standards to be able to be used to do that. We talked about smart work zone technology that, again, can warn about those kind of conditions and allow folks to know that those vehicles may be entering the traffic stream. We also discussed the use of enforcement at those areas, realizing that that may not be possible all the time, depending on the design of the work zone. But again, if you're thinking about that early in the process, the project development process, we might be able to put in some kind of law enforcement pullout areas or something they could utilize near those areas that are going to have high levels of work vehicle traffic coming in and out of the traffic stream. Or there may be other innovative techniques that could be used to help enforcement in those areas. Also, just when you're developing information about work zone safety, about CMV safety in work zones, and we're sharing that with the public, noting and talking about where these speed differentials can occur, why they occur, and educating the public about that was seen as a critical piece to be able to help combat the speed differentials and the crashes that may occur from those. We did throughout the workshops make sure and touch on engineering, enforcement, and education. I hope you're catching that theme as I'm talking a little bit. It's not just all about engineering, but again, a couple of things particular to enforcement that came out of the workshops again was not only the one I just mentioned about the access and egress points, but even potentially using enforcement on the shoulder upstream of queues. Several enforcement agencies are helping with this. They've developed some internal policies about how they're going to handle that, what they allow and don't allow their officers to do. We do acknowledge there are some challenges, especially if the queues grow fairly quickly. Also, if under construction and you have some limitations with shoulders or narrow lanes, obviously that can make it a little bit more difficult to implement that strategy. But again, something to consider. And the earlier in the project you consider it, the more you can coordinate and see if that's a feasible approach within your design. We did hear about a lot of innovative techniques to target dangerous driving behaviors outside and within work zones. Obviously, several states are beginning or have been using automated speed enforcement. One entity was using subdued vehicles. They called them ghost vehicles. They just were painted a little bit differently, so they didn't quite stand out like police vehicles, but they still had the proper markings on them. So as you got closer, you could see that they were law enforcement, lights, etc. But allowed them a little bit different way to enforce. Also, things like trooper in a truck. We had different survey, they look like a survey crew out there. So just different ways that they can observe the behaviors, whether that be speeding or some other dangerous behavior, radio it or communicate it to someone downstream that can safely pull that vehicle over, realizing that work zones can be tight and difficult to enforce those types of actions within the actual work zone itself. And we also just wanted to take a few minutes to highlight a couple of the education themes that we heard throughout. I, again, have mentioned several of them related to the previous engineering topics, but we also want to talk about just incorporating CMV safety-related information into existing work zone safety materials. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but as you're developing your work zone safety materials for Work Zone Safety Awareness Week or other items that you may be doing for a particular project, weave in some information about commercial motor vehicles and how to drive safely around them, what they need to be considered, proper driving behaviors around them, especially in an environment like a work zone. Again, developing materials to explain the proper driving behaviors for dynamic merge. We heard a lot about educating teen drivers about work zone safety and the proper driving behaviors around CMVs. As the requirements for getting your driver's license at a young age have changed in various states, there was a lot of discussion in several states about how supplemental material is really needed to dive into the issues with work zone safety and how to drive around commercial motor vehicles. And several outside organizations have been coming to the table to develop that kind of material and engage teen drivers about work zone safety and the proper driving behaviors around CMVs. And there's also a lot of shareable material that's already developed by the FMCSA. And so encourage you to check that out. Martha is going to go over and have a link for that later on. But there's a lot of material out there for drivers, for non-CMV drivers that could be used for training. And so we just encourage you to go check that out and to use that in any way that you see fit. So that is all that I have. And I'm going to bounce back over to where I can see the chat and start monitoring that. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Darcy and John and Misha can take over from here.
So Melissa, just give us a word when you're done with the chat and we'll hand it over to John.
I think we're good to go. I'm just going to start looking at that while y'all are speaking, and I can see your presentation, so feel free to proceed.
Okay, so John, I will advance next slide as you tell me until I get to my module. So over to you, John.
That sounds terrific. Thank you so much, Darcy. So good afternoon, everybody. My name's John McGregor. I'm at the INDOT Traffic Management Division. I work with the Work Zone Safety section as well as Freeway Service Patrol. And that combination of experience has led to, in part, me at least spearheading the effort with the Q trucks. So joining me today is Misha on this particular presentation. Misha Cochler is the Work Zone Safety Section Supervisor, and Darcy Bullock is our collaborator at Purdue University, who did just a tremendous job, I think, legitimizing and showing the results of this program. So with that, next slide, please, Darcy. So a little bit of the history. This slide does show, the crash occurrences and a lot of the relationship of, the cause and the events focusing on, what were the problems in the work zone. And you can see that big red 49% area right there. The rear end events showed to be a particular concern in these events. And so many of them do include, commercial motor vehicles. I realize this is a CMV presentation, but, we found that, our efforts, in this particular program affect everybody, but CMVs are the biggest player. So that's how it is germane. But again, we saw that, nearly half, involved rear end. So we said, what are we going to do about it? In 2019, we did have a horrible fatality on 465. That is the gold or amber circle around Indianapolis in the center of the state. And that was the moment we just said to ourselves, we've got to do better. Yep, as Darcy is highlighting right there. So that led to a lot of discussions and kind of looking around on what was out there. So with that, next slide, please, Darcy. We acknowledged along the way that there were crashes, and then so many of the worst results came out of secondary crashes. And as you can see there, we've got, trucks getting into it. Again, this is very frequent in work zones. But the heat map there at the bottom left, that shows a primary leading to a secondary event, and the secondary event is really where it exploded. Now, Darcy's going to talk extensively about the heat maps that the Purdue team created, and so I'm going to kind of dial back from that. But really, it just shows the primary event that Darcy highlighted, created some congestion, created a little bit of a problem, but the secondary event is where it really blew up. The big white in the center shows no progression whatsoever. So that's where we're not getting data, but then beyond it, several miles of congestion and a long duration, looking at many hours. That particular event was before 10 in the morning till after 6 at night. that is extreme loss of capacity. So that's the kind of situation we're trying to address with this particular program. So again, next slide, please, Darcy. Throughout this, in our internal discussions, and really, these discussions occurred after some of the original CMV workshops. I was down to one in Arlington before this really came into being. Work zone crashes are a national problem. They're not just Indiana. I know that Martha shared a slide showing, Indiana is a top 10 state. I think part of that story is, we're a freight corridor going around the southern side of the Great Lakes. You have corridor on I-35 moving through Texas and up, toward Arkansas and Oklahoma, and you've got Florida, Georgia, and then California. Some of it's intuitive, but it doesn't mean we hide from it. We're trying to do the best we can. We definitely, want to approach it as a team approach. We recognize that connected vehicle data is critical, and basically we're using that, to tweak approaches, tweak responses as suggested there. I like the image at the bottom of the screen that I believe we were successful because industry, government, and academia all got together. I mean, Darcy's been a collaborator for years at Purdue, but we brought in the construction lobby in Indiana and several of the prime contractors. They worked with us to make this possible. We had some hard discussions throughout that process. We had to understand and recognize the risks and the needs the contractors faced, but together we came up with something that was workable, within the industry. So again, hats off to everybody involved. Next slide again, please, Darcy. So our trucks, basically, they are a glorified attenuator truck, but we made them smart. Again, we made them connected vehicles, and we used connected vehicles to make the work zone safer for everybody, including the CMVs. We are managing it through the connected vehicle data that we're obtaining, but we're also using other feeds as well, whether it be the crowdsourcing information we attain from various third parties. And that speaks to the point there you see in the slide. We are ingesting a heck of a lot of data in real time and taking a commanding use of it in near real time. Again, Darcy's going to show some of that again in the upcoming slides, how we're doing it very effectively. So next slide, please. So again, there's the picture of an N.Q truck. As you see there, it is basically an attenuator truck. This was a private party truck that is not the ideal prototype. We've learned that we want the be prepared to stop message down in front. We want the message board up on top, but less conflicting that way. But again, critical components that are worth mentioning. We're trying to create a brand, the be prepared to stop with the chevroning and the flashing lights across the top that are basically not overwhelming, but an alarming delivery. Hey, look at this. We're commanding the attention of the motorist, and we're trying to make them aware that when they see that, to the point they don't even have to think of it. We've marketed it, and we're trying to create familiarity. So again, we are actively using the connected vehicle data to develop dashboards, as Darcy said, but we're using it strategically to know when and where to deploy these. So these are not cheap trucks to use, and they're identified typically during the planning process in a project. Queue management becomes a big consideration. Ideally, we want to eliminate queues in construction project. We want to design them with minimal queuing, but I think everybody on this call recognizes that queuing on some projects occurs. So with that, we're trying to strategically deploy them. But again, we're partnering with industry, like a couple of companies out there. The Haas product and the Icon are two that have both been used on our queue trucks, and they're helping us get the message out to Waze and ultimately Google Maps on look at where these trucks are, look out for them. So we're creating an awareness of them and the work zone by default in commonly used platforms. So we're excited about that. Next slide, please. Again, this just goes to show that over the years, fatalities have increased, and I don't think that speaks to a lack of dedication or in industry, you know, a cavalier approach. It's just there's a lot of work out there. There's been a lot of congestion. So 2019 was kind of the year for us to kind of take stock and say how we're going to do better, and it's shown in the data. You know, it's been creeping up. I mean, this is nationwide data. You know, we're contrasting the works on fatalities and workers. You know, I've always contended workers cannot be ignored. You know, lifetime of exposure. We've got to do everything we can to protect them, and I believe this Q truck program does that. But we also see out there that, you know, most of the people that die in the work zones are motorists, and a big chunk of them are CMVs. So again, you know, we're trying to support that as well and create the safest work zones, even when queuing is prevalent. Next slide, please, Darcy. So I have to admit, and Darcy beat me to the punch, which is fine. We were not original, you know, in this. We looked around, and when I talk about this program, I've got to take my hat off to Brad Freeze in Tennessee as one of the leaders originally developing the Q truck. We looked around and we built upon it. So as you can see there, we're creating a brand, a logo that, if you would go ahead and go and show the next part, it isn't an accident that our Protect the Q logo that we're trying to brand looks very much like TDOT. We want this to be universally recognized. And as I see Clay said, go TDOT, I'm right there. We had great partners with them, but we want this to be recognized nationally. And you know, I'm in the hopes that, you know, Kentucky is able to jump in and develop this as well, get an I-65 corridor, you know, going from the Midwest down to the South. That would just be an amazing thing to see. But we piggybacked off them. I always have to mention that. So next slide, Darcy, please. So again, as I've talked about, we're using these trucks to deploy a message in advance. We're wanting to warn drivers, particularly truck drivers, they have the hardest time slowing down about congestion. We are, as I've said before, using the message boards, warning signs, strobes. Ultimately, we're trying to wake people up. We know that drivers are distracted. And interstates, and that's where we're deploying these, are particularly entitled motoring situations. I mean, I might expect, you know, driving on US 31, start and stop traffic going home if I drive south, to encounter a number of lights. That's expected. But on interstates, you expect free flow. And I think most of the people on this call recognize that. This is trying to alert them, hey, something different ahead. We really like the fact they're deployable. You know, we can move them around to meet the queue. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And we're getting, again, as I've said, the information out there on the various websites, you know, Waze being a big one. Next slide, please, Darcy. We have information out there, you know, this is a general information site that our NDOT communications people created just to provide general information. This site provides public awareness, a good video there that provides additional content for those that want to learn a little bit about it. But the next slide, if you would, please, Darcy. This one is where we have the content. So there's a training video, different from a general information video. There's a training video there that when we ask people to drive these trucks, we have them watch the video, read over a document, affirm that they understand it. And then we came up with the TQMMCS template. Now that's a whole lot of letters, but as part of what we concluded with the construction lobby, we wanted them to submit how they were going to deploy it. We wanted them engaged and to be part of the process. But one of the immediate pushbacks is we're contractors. We are not designers. We don't want to design anything. So the TQMMCS, traffic quality control means and methods coordination submittal. So we came up with this language basically as an affirmation. We're coordinating, we're acknowledging the designer's design and submitting accordingly. So that's kind of one of the byproducts of our collaboration and some negotiation with the construction lobby. And we've got a special provision. Again, hats off to TDOT. I can never talk about the success of this program without acknowledging them. They shared their special provision and we build upon that. But this is something that's used in the construction projects. Contrasting between Tennessee and NDOT, Presently, we are not yet doing these with our own forces. And if I'm not mistaken, that's how TDOT started out. But they, I think they use them now both on the projects and by maintenance forces. We at NDOT, with the success of this, are considering an abbreviated quick deployment that we can use as maintenance as well. So it's growing. It is being considered internally by maintenance. It's primarily just construction now. So next slide, please, Darcy. And this is another bit of content available. So the backstory here is we have, as many states do, police that patrol or provide queue protection in work zones, and they provide other services as well. We took a card that mirrored that and built it for the protect the queue. We're trying to get the trucks positioned a mile down to a half mile, even a quarter, but the sweet spot is the half mile is shown there on the slide, a little more, a little less, but we just want to wake up motorists so that they're aware of it in time to adjust, but not too soon that they don't forget about it. So again, that content is available on the website I mentioned as well. And we make these available to the drivers. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you, Darcy. This is one that Darcy at Purdue provided, but this shows just the experience of showing up, what a queue truck looks like. Perhaps the video would be better, but these are not trivial to see. And there it is. The next slide. Boom. As you approach it, you see the queue truck. You should be able to read the "Be prepared to stop," which is integral to the messaging. But what shows up as well in the background, we have an alert on Waze. That if the driver has it up, they know, oh, 1.1 mile away. This might be a bit far, but it's still effective. And Darcy's going to talk about that. The overall effectiveness of the program is still effective to get the message out there. So, these are neat to, you don't ignore them as you approach them, and they're doing a lot more than just sitting there on the side of the road. So next slide, please. We think we're making a difference. Now, we aggregated crash data, and we looked at just April to November. That is the typical construction, time in Indiana. We're a little bit beyond it now and still rolling, but that's the heat of it. And we also acknowledge, looking at this slide, that 2020 was an anomaly. COVID changed the world for a lot of us, but still, I'm looking at the progression of interstate crashes, and it's a downward progression, so it's a reduction, and we're pretty excited about that. I can't claim that the queue trucks are all of that. Likely they're not, but we do believe they're helping, and they're telling a great story. So with that, next slide, please. And this is time for me to hand it back to Darcy for his part, and Mish, I think, will participate as well at some point. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, John. So hopefully I wasn't too disruptive there with the highlights, but this has been a team effort. Martha, Melissa, Sarah, thank you for your help on this. What I'm going to do is try to build on what John talked about. He foreshadowed a little bit about connected vehicle data. And as he talked about, those trucks out there, those queue trucks are connected, but we're also bringing connected vehicle data in from the vehicles traversing the roads. So I think Martha, or Melissa, you had 43% of the crashes were rear end in work zones. We got 49 or 50%. We have very similar numbers. And what I'm going to talk about is how we're using that connected vehicle data. Before I jump in, and I know I'm looking here at the list of participants around the country and Melissa's polls that are all state DOTs. Oftentimes we give this presentation to people who don't know what a mile marker is, but I am going to just show you these mile markers just to kind of give you situational awareness of this construction work zone that I'm going to talk about in the Lebanon, Indiana area, just north of the Indianapolis area. So a couple mile markers along through here. This is in the 145-ish range, and these were photos taken earlier this year. And what I'm going to now, this is a very dense figure, and what I'm going to try to do in the next couple slides, and after I kind of break it apart, I'm going to volley to Misha to maybe make some commentary. But as John said, data is critical for work zone management. And I think when Melissa, you started out with your slides earlier, you segmented on verified queues present. I think over the last few years, as we've talked about smart work zones, we have at least come to the conclusion here in Indiana that the connected vehicle data is probably more robust for identifying where the queues are than being dependent upon putting out sensors at, say, quarter or half mile spacing. So I'm going to share with you how that connected vehicle data looks here and what we're doing with it. So as we go through this, there's kind of 4 items you want to be able to read off these heat maps: the location, the speed, where the queue truck is, and then this notion of hard braking. I'm going to step through each one of those. So if we look at these boxes over here on the right, I'm showing you I-65 South. And this is mile marker 150, 148, 146, all the way down to 130. So the y-axis there is the linear spatial location along I-65. And traffic is driving from top to bottom. And then in terms of the speed, I've got this legend along the bottom here, greater than 65, all the way down to the purples, which are 0 to 14. So, and then the last thing is, and maybe the time here is within the day, from midnight, 6 a.m., noon, 6 p.m., midnight, you can really quickly, at a glance, over a 30-mile region, see where our queues are, where that back of the queue is, how it might be progressing, and then when it clears. And then if we look at this purple line here, that's the location of our queue truck. So we have telematics on all of our queue trucks. So when they're out there on the interstate, we know exactly where they are relative to the queue. And as John indicated earlier, the sweet spot, pick your number, is about a half mile above, in advance of the queue. So this gives us a tool to monitor how close or how well, or are they even deployed out there. And I think as you work through, there's always a difference between here's where we're modeling there might be queuing, and here's where we may actually get queuing. So having this agile connected vehicle data that tells us what's going on there with queuing and where our queue trucks is really important. And then the last point I'm going to put up here talk about is these hard braking events. And those are those red dots. And the geeky number there is 0.27 G. That's probably not a terribly hard, it's not a screeching stop at a traffic signal, but it's a very firm braking maneuver on the interstate. And if we're seeing that type of firm braking number, that's one that's been identified by the insurance industry as kind of a risk factor. That's something we don't want on the interstate. So now we can look at a week of data, and this is where the connected vehicle data is just beautiful, because you don't have to deploy any sensors. You literally turn on a data stream from a data provider, and I'm showing you in 2 directions, northbound and southbound, a 20-mile image of the interstate, 130 to 150, over, in this particular case, is Monday through Thursday, so over a little over 4 days. And you can see at a glance the recurring nightly congestion in the work zone where they're taking a lane during the evening. And then I'll come up to this a little bit later. This is actually an incident that was unexpected that we'll compare with. And then we can bring in what we call hard braking events. So I'm just going to toggle back and forth. No hard braking events. Now I bring in those red dots. And what you really want to start looking at, and I'm going to foreshadow just a little bit, this is a queue that was unexpected due to an incident and didn't have any queue protection. And if you kind of see that clustering of dots at the back, that's exactly what John McGregor was talking about. We want to alert drivers that there's a queue coming up. So now I'm transitioning into these purple lines. So when you see these purple lines, this is where the queue truck is. And if you look up here, this was one that was not planned. It was an incident there. You can see there's more hard braking. So what we did is we know hard braking is a risk factor for crashes. And Debbie Horton earlier put a link into a paper that John McGregor referenced that talks about a study NDOT did a couple years ago that basically showed for about every 150 hard braking events out there in 2019, we saw a crash. It had a very strong correlation coefficient on it. So if we can reduce those hard braking events, we can reduce crashes. So now what I'm going to do is just kind of take a little bit deeper dive, and I'm going to compare those two days. This particular location was one with a Q truck. It had 2 hard braking events over 5 hours. This one had 9 hard braking events over 3 hours with no Q truck present. What we did is we went through and did a extensive over 400 hours of queuing, and we normalized it during the same hours, and we looked to compare. Okay, here's a location on the interstate that had a Q truck. We had 3 hard braking events. Here's a job that did not have a Q truck. It had 29 hard braking events, almost a factor of 10. So we scaled that May analysis, and one of our students went through and analyzed several dozen work zones. And I'm going to bring Misha into the conversation in just a little bit. So Misha, I'm foreshadowing just a little bit when I'm going to show the next one, and then maybe I'm going to kind of volley over to you in terms of how the telematics on the Q truck is helpful in relation to where the queues are. But I just want to kind of maybe bring a full-size picture of Misha in to give him credit, because Misha has been just a huge asset. It's one thing to look at the data, but if all we do is admire the data and we don't have partners like Misha and John McGregor to do something, all we're doing is admiring the data. And they've been the ones that have been behind this. They're working hand in hand with the contractors to actively make decisions. So maybe Misha, maybe volley over to you. And I think one of the things you've been focusing on is kind of looking at Q truck placement relative to queues. Over to you, Misha. And you might be on mute.
Thank you, Darcy. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. I'm recovering from that photo. I was surprised by that. All right. Thank you. Let me just begin by acknowledging that Purdue Research has produced just a whole host of awesome and game-changing tools that we as an agency are utilizing, on a daily basis and have come to depend on. And today we're just focusing on one of them, the heat map. And, by itself, its capabilities and its usefulness are just, used every day. I also want to just throw out a quick kudos to my boss. Why not on a national webinar, get a little brown nosing in. But yeah, kudos to John and his efforts for spearheading the Q truck program, because it is extremely effective at reducing back of queue type crashes and queuing. And the heat map, as Darcy has been showing, really confirms that. So we do use the heat map for a number of things. First of all, since we've been talking about the Q truck program, where we've been employing the heat maps has been as a planning tool as well. Once you've got a work zone set up and you've got even a week's worth of data, you can go back, pull up the heat map, look at it, and use that as a planning tool for your crews. When do we need to have the crews out there? When, where do they need to be thinking about setting up? How long will they be out there? So that's great as a planning tool, and then also as an after action. From the slide that he's got up right there, if you've got multiple Q trucks deployed, you can see how their staging is working, and if they're being located and employed correctly, and it's just really amazing. When you also pull up that hard braking data in conjunction with the heat maps. I'm sorry, with the Waze data shown with the purple lines, becomes really fairly easy to ascertain whether or not the Q trucks are being deployed correctly.
Awesome.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
Also, we do use the heat maps for a slew of other tasks, like for example, in work zones, we go out and do our work zone reviews. We identify issues and problems, and one of the great tools that we can rely on to help get buy-in in the field that yes, there's a problem and we need to fix it, is the heat map, and especially the hard braking data. Through that, we can tie this back to CMV specifically. Specific work zones where we've had issues with trucks striking barriers, or issues with trucks often are correlating to tight conditions or problematic transitions, and those are focus points for us as well. Dealing with CMVs, but the heat map and the hard braking data both help highlight those locations, as well as when we're looking to see if our recommendations are being effective. They help confirm that as well too. The heat map too, I don't think we're going to talk about everything that the heat map can do, but I mean, you can overlay weather information, you can get vehicle trajectories through the work zone, on the heat map itself. It's tied to the traffic cameras that are available. If there are cameras available, we can cycle through, the photos by cycling through using a slider on the tool, which is very handy when we're looking at, one of the other things we use the heat map for, which is, crash causation, when we're looking at could the work zone have been a contributing factor to different crashes. So, I mean, this tool is just loaded with different tools and features that help make that possible or somewhat easier. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Darcy. Thank you.
Thanks, Misha. So just to I'm kind of into that recap phase, and I'll show you kind of the GWIS stats at the end. But just to recap, the Q truck analysis, Misha and John have deployed these around the state. I'll show you just some images from I-70. We have become a huge believer in the connected vehicle data because you can see the trajectory data, the hard braking, and the travel time. John showed with you seeing the Q trucks relative to, in this particular case, the Q is right off there, about a half mile ahead, and that's when we want to get that warning in. And the goal, as John said, is to avoid those secondary crashes. So now the question is, did it work? So we know if we can reduce hard braking, we know we can reduce crashes. So one of the other colleagues in the photo there, Rahul and Gerard and Gijo, analyzed 430 hours of queuing, and these red dots are basically the rate of hard braking per connected vehicle trajectory, and then the green dots when we didn't have the Q truck, and then the green X's are when we had the Q truck out there. So we had an 80% reduction. So Melissa, when you started out with some of your slides at the beginning in terms of the confirmed Qs, I think this is fairly similar to that type of results. And the part that's exciting about this is this scales really well nationally. So as Melissa and Martha talked out, half our crashes in Indiana are back of Q. If we can reduce that, that's wonderful. John talked about we are actually seeing reduction of crashes out there on the interstate. This is just 1 year of data. Volumes in 2021 were more or less what 2019 was. So we're feeling very, very confident between the reduction we've seen in the crashes as well as the reduction in the hard braking. I see there's some queries for some slides on this. All of these are in this paper. There's a QR code if you scale. Debbie's put a link to that paper in the chat, so if you want to click on that. But with that, Martha and Melissa, several questions coming into the queue. So I think one of you guys maybe will moderate those as we talk through that.
Yes, we're going to let Martha finish up with some resource discussion, and then I'll start going through the chat box and asking those questions.
Okay, so that's the end of our presentation. I hope it's been an awesome teamwork between INDOT, Purdue, and the contractor partners. I hope that message, John, Misha, and I got that message across. So now over to Martha.
Sorry. Thank you, everyone. Darcy, John, Misha, great presentations. Thank you very much. Melissa, would you please pull our present? Thank you. So yeah, so you heard from Melissa as well. Thank you very much. We have great presentations, and we have talked about a lot of our efforts. And Melissa mentioned something about the engineering, enforcement, and education. So throughout this effort, we have been sharing not only with the top opportunity state, but all the stakeholders that have been involved with our efforts throughout the years, is that it goes beyond the engineering. This effort is engineering, enforcement, education, and evaluation as well. Go back and see if what you try in any of these three areas is working and what else can be done about it. So next, please. So throughout this effort, the Federal Highway Administration, under the Work Zone Safety Grant Program, we have two grantees, the RTBA as well as the University of Wisconsin. But for the most part, RTBA and TTI, they have developed a series of documents. So one of them is a design document that is tailored to designers, so transportation agencies, looking for ideas on how to accommodate large trucks or CMV in work zones. Prior to this, I forgot to mention, prior to the agreement between the three U.S. DOT agencies of using CMV, we used to call this effort large truck safety and work zones. So that's why we have called this document large truck safety publication. But again, it could help as well as when you are designing and trying to accommodate commercial motor vehicle, again, large truck and buses. We also have an Improving Large Truck Safety and Work Zones online course. We have developed 3 fact sheets, and as part of that, we have an online course as well. Next, please. These are available, all these documents that I'm sharing right now, they are available on the National Work Zone Safety Information Clearinghouse website. We have a web page dedicated to improving large truck safety and work zones. So we have, again, this is another fact sheet with an online course, and these online courses, this in particular is about large truck. They're about 30-45 minutes long. You will need to create an account in order to access them, but they're free. So I welcome anybody who would like to learn more about accommodating CMV vehicles in work zones to try these free online courses. There is also another great document on the National Work Zone Safety Information Clearinghouse that can help others to develop work zone access and egress. Next slide, please. This is another fact sheet. They use a smart work zone technology. We have innovative end of queue warning systems. There's a fact sheet based on a study from Texas where they saw a reduction up to 45% by implementing queue warning systems. Next one, please. Then we also have on the National Work Zone Safety Information Clearinghouse website a Safe Trucking Through Work Zones brochure and presentation that has been developed. They both have been developed for CDL drivers schools that could be used if they want to add some of their training targeted to work zone safety. They could use that information. Again, it's available for free on the Clearinghouse website. And then the University of Wisconsin at Madison developed, as part of their designer series, a document to help transportation agencies to accommodate oversized, overweight vehicles in work zones. Next, please. So I encourage everybody to visit the Federal Highway Work Zone Management website. We have been promoting for the past 3 years or so National Work Zone Awareness Week beyond the typical driver. Federal Motor Carrier has been joining us and have developed great resources during National Work Zone Awareness Week to promote commercial motor vehicle safe driving. And then we also, I mentioned that Works on Safety Information Clearinghouse website. So there is that page that I think we will share in a minute, but there is also a listserv dedicated just for commercial motor vehicles. So if you feel like that you have a question, feel free to check that listserv dedicated for commercial motor vehicle as well. Next, please. So here's the web page that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Improving Large Truck Safety in Work Zones. You will have publications, different resources developed by DOTs, by US DOT as well. So links to the Federal Motor Carrier materials that I mentioned, you can find them as well there. You can find the documents that I mentioned earlier. There are some publications, again, resources, some DOTs we found, I believe it was from Texas, we found some documents that can be used as educational materials in Spanish. So there's something that I forgot to mention is that as you look into different strategies, you may want to use your outreach materials, and depending on your drivers, you may want to look into other languages, whereas Spanish, Russian. Again, there's I don't know how will be the drivers that go through your state, but that is something that you may want to look at as you look into different efforts and strategies. Again, thinking about the 3 E's, the education, the enforcement, and the engineering. We found throughout these workshops that having a great conversation, communication efforts with trucking associations, not only you can share that information of the work zones, but they can give you feedback. They can share information with their truck drivers, whether it's those that are working in your state or those that could be passing through your state. So remember also to keep in mind your neighboring states, because if you have a project that it will be close to your next state, you may want to coordinate efforts with them as well. So I mentioned the Federal Motor Carrier, Our Roads, Our Safety campaigns, a lot of great materials that are there in Spanish and English. And those are the links. Next, please. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Melissa, so we can go over the Q&As.
Right, I'd like to invite all our speakers to turn back on their mics, maybe, and at least their videos, and I will just start at the top and look at several questions that we have coming in. Also, I will remind you, you can enter a question or comment in the chat, which I'm going to start with. But if you'd like to unmute and verbally ask a question, I just ask that you use the raise the hand feature. So again, the person that's smiling and raising their hand across the top feature of your screen there, if you'll click on that, then that'll notify me, and I will call on you as soon as we go through a few questions here in the chat. So just one thing I want to address is several people asked about the presentation and the recording. So we will be making this available at some point in 2022. So we have to do a lot of things and get a lot of approvals before it can be posted. But the goal at some point is to get it posted and available to you. So just note that. We also want to make sure and note that there are a couple links to some papers that were referenced in Darcy and John and Misha's presentation in the chat box for you. So one of the first questions is says, we have heard from some CMV operators that they want increased distance for advance notice to work zones. Instead of the typical 2 to 3 miles ahead of the queue, they want 7 to 10 miles so they can reroute. Is anyone else hearing the same thing or doing that in practice? Martha or any of our DOT partners, are y'all hearing that? I know it's not quite exactly on the topic of today, but something that somebody's asking as far as a question.
I will start first. Yes, and that's the reason why we encourage everyone to have a great relationship with your local trucking association in your state. They like to share that information in advance, especially if you have detours. So we always encourage everyone, as you are planning your project, to take into consideration, or scoping the project, to take into considerations the impacts of the CMV driver. So if you have a detour route that can accommodate trucks, you can do that, but definitely you can also share with trucking associations when your lane closures are happening. So then if they're happening during the day, they could change their driving hours, but I'll encourage everyone to do that. So I will let John and Misha talk about from their DOT perspective.
Sure. So at NDOT, we have the Indiana IN 511 system, which uses a CARS platform, Castle Rock, where we report lane closures, restrictions. Interestingly, that platform is used by freight for detour planning as well. So it is incumbent on our project staff, when they have a lane restriction, to put it in there to do the detour planning there, and that is available to Indiana Motor Carrier. They use this as well for theirs. I saw also another question that kind of ties in about using advanced queue detection and warning systems. And we used where we created an extended one over the expanse between Indianapolis and the Ohio state line, where we were able to blend 3 contracts together into one protracted queue detection and warning system. And there we had continuous messaging for that entire corridor. Those kind of messaging systems are difficult to deploy when you have, different projects here and there. That was a unique opportunity where we had an entire corridor. We think in due course that, is going to eventually, become a virtual online in-cab announcement. I think the industry's headed there, but that's our experience with those systems.
I will just say that throughout the workshops, we did hear this mentioned about more advance notice. And as John just kind of alluded to, a lot of discussions around how to get those advance notice inside the cab of the vehicle itself. So that was something we talked about. If somebody else that's participating has a response to that, feel free to type that in the chat. So a question about the queue trucks. How do you ensure that the queue trucks are being positioned, used appropriately by the contractor? And then the second part to that question is there a mechanism in your contracts to penalize the contractor for failure to provide the trucks per the spec, particularly failure to move the truck as the queue increases?
Well, I'd say yes and no. So the first the first question is how to make sure they're doing it. Well, the answer is the same as the second question. Project staff needs to be aware. Now, I'd mentioned that TQMCCS, Traffic Quality Control Means and Methods Coordination Submittal. In theory, that engages them. Now, we all know that contractors do what contractors do. What is interesting to me about the research that Darcy did is, if you get into the heat maps, you can see, and I see a perfect slide there. You've got different placements. On one hand, you've got the queue truck right up against the queue on the left. On the right, it looks like they're a couple miles out. In the middle slide, it almost, at least around the 6 p.m. hour, looks like the nearer ideal situation where you've got the truck in advance of the queue. Like I said, there's different opinions about this. These trucks were designed that were trying to wake people up, tell them that yes, there's a problem, but you need to think about reacting to it, but not so close to slamming on the brakes. But irrespective of the exact placement, we found that they were generally effective. That was surprising to me. The presence of them, I think the success is driven more by the presence of the queue trucks than the exact placement. But we know we don't want them right up on top of where the drivers have to jam down the brakes, and we don't want them so far out that they forget about it. So that question goes back to more advanced notice for detour planning. That's a whole different result, and I understand that truckers want that. Then what we're trying to do is make people aware of an immediate threat.
So maybe I just add one comment just to support John. I think the key thing is mapping the queue truck into the connected vehicle data milepost. As John pointed out, I think this year, John, we were still learning what was that best placement. So probably 2 miles ahead is probably a little too far. Here was a case where we probably had the Q overtake the Q truck. This was, the Goldilocks just right one. And I think, this is April. This was like 5 days into it, right?
Right. And there's another important point that wasn't mentioned. One of the concerns we encountered when we worked with the construction lobby here in Indiana is they do not want to back up their trucks. That there are insurance issues with that. They need to drive around. So the typical deployment is to have 2 trucks present, one in a standby position and one protecting the queue. And when the queue truck is overtaken by a growing queue, the second one jumps into a protect the queue position. The other one circles back in some manner. However, as the queue dissipates, obviously the queue truck can drive forward. So there are some logistical challenges to doing this that we tried to manage by using a second truck in almost every application.
Great, thank you. Darcy, I think this next question may be for you. It says, where are you obtaining the connected vehicle data from, especially a second person tagged onto that asking, especially the hard braking events?
Okay, so we're data agnostic, but the data provider we're getting it from is Wejo. And the reason we like that, Melissa, is not only do we get the individual trajectories going through, but we get the hard braking, and then we can also calculate the travel time through. It also gives us the ability to do some of the detour analysis. And what we're finding, we had one of those earlier questions on routing, is because the commercial drivers are using their own software, sometimes they're routing on alternative routes other than the assigned detour route. So in summary, we're using the Wejo data to get both the trajectory data and the hard braking data.
Some more data questions for you. Another question came in. How do you synchronize the Icon HOS or advanced warning vehicle to the software to do this analysis?
So what we do is we use basically the state base GIS file. So we have when we ingest the connected vehicle data records, every point that we bring in, we immediately assign it to the nearest mile marker down to about 100th of a mile. So whether we're bringing in Wejo connected data or whether we're bringing in HOS or icons, we map that latitude and longitude to the linear reference. And so then those purple lines for the position of the Q truck are referenced exactly to the same mile marker scheme that we're using for the Wejo connected vehicle data.
Okay, great. And then another question asked, are the heat maps developed only with the HOS and Icon data, or is there other data involved? And you may have mentioned that by mentioning the Wejo data, but just wanted to make sure that answered that question as well. So
yeah, so these heat maps are, I mean, in general, we've got multiple, it is HOS, icons, and Wejo. We also have an INRIX layer, and we also have a weather data layer. So once you reference the data to mileposts, sometimes you want to toggle back and forth between heavy rain events or heavy wind events. So basically, we reference all of our geocoded data to the milepost, and that's what we're bringing in right now.
Great. I think this may be a question back for John or Misha, is how do you decide if a project will have the Q trucks included in the maintenance of traffic, or MOT? Obviously, not every project can have a Q truck, nor do all of them necessitate them.
Yeah, absolutely correct. So this is a byproduct of our lane closure policy. Again, as I mentioned in my presentation, the ideal goal would be to not have queuing in any of our projects. We know that's not a reality. So when we do our queue modeling and we evaluate the effect of the job, it really is a function of the amount of queuing and the risk to the motorist. The risk to the motorist obviously includes volume of people approaching, as well as I'd almost call it the spikiness. I mean, if you have a situation where you don't have just a massive amount of queuing all the time, but it can break out, it's kind of on the edge, and it's kind of a continuous function, that would be something to look at too. We're really trying to, we don't have a great algorithm, but we do have a high level individual looking at, okay, you've got queuing, you've got risk. Sometimes you just have massive queuing building up, and that's something that needs to protect. Sometimes you have this breakout queuing over a particularly long time, and a lot of people driving into it. It's kind of a gut sanity check, because these are a resource. These are a tremendous expense, and we're trying to protect the drivers and the workers with this process. So it's not an exact science, but it is a function of queue, risk, volume, things like that. And it's made by somebody, an experienced high-level person that is responsible for looking at our queue modeling.
John, maybe let me jump into just one other little to support you. I just got I-74 heat map up there, and I-74, is a corridor that doesn't have much traffic. And as you point, your conceptual perspective is it's green most of the time. And if we compare that with like I-74, I'm sorry, I-70, any little hiccup on I-70 creates queuing. And I'm just kind of looking backwards, the TiVo mode on I-70, after the construction zone wind up, I mean, you see little hiccups, but it was a very fragile construction zone with heavy traffic. So maybe just to build on it, I mean, some of the things that you codify when you do intuitively is you look at a corridor and you say, oh man, is there anything that has little incidents, little perturbations, do they suddenly create a 5-mile queue? That's probably a pretty good flag for that's a corridor that might be right for that. I don't know. I'm just spitballing a little bit, John. Hopefully I didn't get too off script.
No, I think that's terrific. And the flip side, though, is when you do a queue prediction and it shows very little queuing, but you look at the severity of that. How much more queuing could result by just adding a little bit more traffic? Does it blow up then? How safe is a no queue prediction when it says no queue? Does it just take a couple more cars an hour to start to make a problem, or things of that nature? The safety of the prediction, given the realities we're dealing with. I don't know if I said that very well, but I can speak to a place on I-70 near the Terre Haute area on the western side of the state. That is a place where often queue modeling predicts it's going to be just fine, but we've also learned over the years that not true. You start to do the work there and it could blow up. So I mean, very frankly, that speaks to just experience as well. We do know our areas throughout the state, and that is again a call made by a high-level NDOT engineer.
And I think that, sorry, John, I think that ties back into something that we heard throughout the workshops, is just really looking at that sensitivity analysis you're talking about and kind of running a couple of different models. So you have your best guess based on what you know, but what happens if I tweak it up a little or tweak it down a little, and see what the probability of that is. And then in turn, using these findings that you have, this data from actual work zones, to feed back into that process. So I think it's really great. I do see that somebody asked about you having a standard for your queue warning truck, and you place that in the chat box. So if you're looking for that special provision or specification, John has plopped a link over there in the chat box for you to be able to click on. So thank you for that. Have a couple more questions. Let's see if we can try to get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. Do want to give Martha a moment to close us. But another question, have you looked at a queue warning system that uses sensors and portable changeable message signs? If so, were there different benefits between the queue truck and those types of queue warning systems?
Maybe John, over to you.
Sure. I mean, yes, we have used those as well. I think they're a terrific product. I'd mentioned earlier in this discussion the opportunity we had to do pretty much Indy to Ohio. That was a unique opportunity. Another case where I think they make the most sense, let's say you're doing bridge work, bridge deck overlay, or more substantial work, where you're creating queuing at a finite spot. You know it's going to be there for a long period of time. Queue detection and warning systems are ideal for that. The event I mentioned in 2019 where we had a horrible fatality in Indy, we were doing a glorified maintenance job. You know, weekend closure, we're working here. You know, you dig it out, you put the concrete in, you let it set up, you open it up for the week. We were moving all over the place. These transient projects require the ability to be transient in our safety measures. So when the work area is moving, I think you lose the benefit of the queue detection warning system, and I believe the queue trucks are most beneficial.
Then someone asked if you have cost information on the queue trucks. Maybe that's something y'all can link up online if you don't have those numbers handy, or if you don't have the ability to speak to that here on the webinar.
I could throw out a guess, but in this venue, I want to be careful with that because, you know, information is still developing, and, you know, I'm sure there's regional costs for the people all over that they're considering this.
Darcy does have your email showing on the screen, so if that person would like to maybe talk to you offline, I think that would be probably the most appropriate for that. There was someone that came in. We did early on, Jerry's asking about the use of the zipper merge. We called it the dynamic merge earlier, and some of the information that I discussed about just the use of that by several states. But they're wondering how compatible the queue truck program is with that strategy, and if you've used it with that strategy.
Short answer, no, we have not used the queue truck with a zipper strategy. Generally in Indiana, we're trying not to use the zipper merges on the interstate. Our belief is that zipper merges are more appropriate in lower speed approaches where stopping is more predictable. That can be within signals, you know, systems, or just lower speed approaches. But we have great concerns about the risk of a zipper merge on the interstate or on high-speed approaches because of the risk associated with that. We have generally tried to avoid those.
Okay, I do want to note that Sarah has posted several of the links that Martha had in the presentation in the chat box so that you can more easily access those, since it will be a while before the presentation is available. So check that out as well. There are several other questions here. Let me see if I can just maybe get to this one. Somebody said they had found that many CMV drivers are not using mapping applications specific to commercial motor vehicle routes. They're relying on passenger vehicle applications. And this has resulted in CMVs traveling in height restrictions or width restriction zones. Is anybody looking at solutions to enforce mapping apps? I will just say that we had this conversation at several of the workshops. I can't remember exactly which state we had it the most in depth, but talking and bringing those mapping agencies to the table, especially trying to convey your work zone conditions to those mapping agencies so they're adequately portraying that, you know, is an item that we need to work on and try to come to the table with different stakeholders. I don't know if any of the rest of our panel quickly has an answer to that, Martha, but I do believe that'll be the last kind of question that we can attend to before we close out today with Martha's final comments.
The only comment that I wanted to add, which I agree with that comment, is that there are some DOTs that are trying in-cab messaging for trucks, like North Carolina DOT has a pilot. I believe New Jersey and some other states are looking into that. So with that in-cab, it will be particular to CMV vehicles, and they'll get that work zone information. But yeah, we have heard about that issue, and we'll bring it up to our partners and see what else can be done. But I don't know if our stakeholders today, Indiana or Purdue, have any comment on that.
It's a problem. We just had a bridge or the closure on the interstate got damaged by vehicles diverting off system. It's a problem. It definitely needs to be discussed, and it's a broader conversation. It's the trucking industry that needs to be brought into that conversation.
All right, well, thank you all for participating in the chat. Martha, I'll turn it over to you to finish us up.
Yeah, again, thank you, John, Misha, I'm sorry, Darcy, Melissa, and all of you for joining us today. As you can see, we still have John, Misha, and Darcy's contact information here available, so feel free to follow up with them if you have any questions. But as mentioned earlier, we are going to record this and post it at a later date, and I encourage all of you to use some of the strategies discussed today. If you have any further questions or think about any other strategies, feel free to contact me at any time. Again, thank you very much for your time and happy holidays.